If you've ever felt frustrated by inconsistent code formatting because you have to go back and fix it manually every time, then look no further because we have Prettier. This amazing extension for Visual Studio Code acts like a code stylist, automatically formatting your code based on a predefined set of rules. Prettier makes sure that your code looks clean, consistent, and easy to read. Sounds awesome, right? So let's see how it works. First, you need to install the extension, so let's do that. I'm Estefania, welcome back to my channel. To install Prettier, you just go to your extensions and then you search for Prettier. The first search result should be exactly what you're looking for, and then you can click on install over here. Should take a couple of milliseconds and then you should have it installed. It's pretty small. The publisher is prettier.io. So now that we have this installed, the actual extension, let's check the supported languages. Here we can see that it supports these languages: JavaScript, TypeScript, Flow, JSX, JSON, CSS, SCSS, LESS, HTML, Vue, Angular, Handlebars, Ember, Glimmer, GraphQL, Markdown, and YAML. So now that you have the extension installed, let's install Prettier in the command line interface, because if we search for Prettier resolution in the extension documentation, we will see that to fix the version of Prettier that we are using in a project, we will need to run a command. We see that this extension will use Prettier from your project's local dependencies. This is recommended. When this setting, Prettier resolve global modules, is set to true, then the extension can also attempt to resolve global modules if you have Prettier installed globally. Should Prettier not be installed locally with your project's dependencies or globally on the machine, the version of Prettier that is bundled with the extension will be used. So, in case we want to have control of that version and we want to install Prettier in a project and pin its version as recommended, here we can see that it is recommended, we need to run this command. The command is npm install prettier d save exact. I'm going to copy this like this, and then I'm going to go to my project. Right now I am encoding with Estefania, this folder that I created for the channel, and I'm going to start the terminal, open the terminal. In the terminal, I'm going to start or create a package.json file with npm in it. npm is what we use to install packages. It comes with Node.js, so you may need to download that and install it if you don't have npm already. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a package.json file with everything by default. We're just going to keep the default package name, default version, empty description, the default entry point, test command, keywords, authors, license. Just for the sake of this demo, we're going to keep all the default values and empty if we can. Is this okay? Yes. So now we see our package.json file over here with everything by default. What is our next step? If we want to check the version of Prettier that we currently have available, we could try to run npx prettier -- version. Okay, to check if we have anything there available because we already installed the extension. So we're going to run that and check if we have a version. Right now we have 3.2.5, which is the version that comes bundled with the extension. But if we want to take that instead of using the extension, we want to actually choose the version that we want to use, or we want to keep that fixed as a local dependency, we can run this command, paste. We paste the command and then we run it like this. Then you will see that we have a package log.json file which tracks all the changes in our package.json file, and we see a new folder with the node modules. And we find Prettier over here. We don't actually need anything inside that folder, but we just know that Prettier is installed. So after we have Prettier, again, we can run npx prettier -- version, and then we see 3.2.5. So we still have the same version, but if they were different, we could take that from the local dependencies. So now that we have that ready and we check the version, we're going to see how you can actually set Prettier as your default formatter. Because let's create a new file and let's call this index.js, just to stay consistent with our JSON file, with our package.json file. Here we have our index, and let's just write a sample code. If a is greater than 10, we're going to console.log a, else we're going to console.log a times 2. Just as an example, we're going to check how Prettier is going to fix the spacing and the indentation and other features of the style of our code automatically. I'm going to change this to 2 spaces. Great. Let's see how we can actually use Prettier. If we go to our settings, like this in the gear icon, and then we click on settings, if we go to Prettier, we will find at the very bottom this option, Editor Default Formatter. This defines a default formatter which takes precedence over all the other formatter settings. Right now it's none by default, but we can choose from this list of formatters, and I'm going to see if Prettier is available over here. Yes, it is here in the list, Prettier. Code formatter, so we're going to choose Prettier. Great, so now we have it as our default formatter for all languages. We can see that this will be the default formatter for all languages if we go to our command palette with Command-Shift-P, and we see here we go to Open User Settings. Open User Settings in JSON format. If we go here, you can see that I've customized many user settings. Here we can see it, the last one that we added here. Editor.default-formatter. This setting, this property, is set to Prettier in VS Code. So this will be the default formatter for all languages. But if we want this to be the formatter for a specific language, we can also add this setting to a specific language. How can we format this code manually, like running a command or using a keyboard shortcut? Let's say that I am not following the style guide at all and this code looks really bad. I want to format it nicely with just a few clicks. How can I do that? Well, right now I'm saving the file and nothing is changing, right? But if I want to format the file, I just need to click on Shift Option F on macOS. On Windows, that would be Shift-Alt-F. And then I can save my file because it's formatted nicely. You can see how it's actually following our guidelines for the spaces, and it is following the best practices for writing readable JavaScript code. We also have the option to let me just undo all of this and go back to the ugly format. And if we open the command palette and we search for Format Document, we can click on this command and it will be formatted automatically according to the rules of Prettier. Awesome, right? But that is a more manual process. How can we save some time and automate this so the file is formatted every time we save it automatically? Well, that is Format on Save, and it's actually quite helpful. Let's go back again to that ugly format and let's enable Format on Save. For that, we need to go to our settings and then we search for Format on Save. This is a specific setting in Visual Studio Code. If we check this, by default it's not enabled. If we enable this, we're going to format the file on save. For this, a formatter must be available, the file must not be saved after a delay, and the editor must not be shutting down. So we customize this and then we close the settings, and now if we make a change to our file, you can see the little white dot here, and then I save the file, voila! Everything goes back to normal, we have the nice format and the code is readable and easy to understand. That is Format on Save. You can also disable that for specific languages, and let me show you this. If we go to the documentation, Format on Save, and we go here, you can turn on Format on Save on a per language basis by scooping the setting over here in the user settings in the JSON file that we just saw. If we want to Format on Save only on JavaScript, and we don't want to Format on Save on any other programming language, then we can scope this setting to JavaScript only. But if we do want to enable this globally for all the programming languages, we would set this to true and then this to false for that specific programming language. So that's how you can actually disable this for specific programming languages. Now that you know how to enable and disable format on save, we're going to see some configuration settings, some settings that you can customize for Prettier. Let's go to our settings and let's search for Prettier. There are tons of settings that you can choose from and customize. We're just gonna have a quick overview of some of the most important ones. You can set a path to the Prettier configuration file. You can enable, control whether Prettier is enabled or not. This requires a reload because you can disable Prettier whenever you need to, just like you disable an extension. You can specify the end of line used by Prettier. You can ignore specific files, and we will see that in just a moment, but this is where you set the name of the file that is going to define what you want to ignore. It's sort of like a git ignore file, but for Prettier. Brackets on the same line, bracket spacing. There are many different style guides to choose from, print width, and so on. If you want to add a semicolon at the end of every line, this is very subjective, like in JavaScript, doesn't really change the functionality. But if you want to add it, you can keep this enabled or you can disable it. You can also keep a single attribute per line. This is interesting. It enforces a single attribute per line in HTML, JSX, Vue, and Angular. I think this will be very interesting. I'm going to enable this and I'm going to create an HTML file. Just index.html. If we use this Emmet abbreviation to have the basic HTML structure and I save the file, let's see what happens. Voila, this is what happens. You can see that each attribute in HTML is on a separate line. Really awesome, right? You can also change if you want to use single quotes or double quotes. You can change the tab width, the number of spaces it should use per tab, and if you want to indent lines with tabs or spaces. So there are many different things that you can customize here, and at the end you will also see the list with the default formatter. Let's talk about the Prettier configuration file, which is another great way of defining how we want to configure the format and the style of our files. For that, let's go to the Prettier documentation, the official Prettier documentation. Here we can see configuration file. You can configure Prettier via in order of precedence. We can have a Prettier key in our package.json file. So if we do have Prettier installed as a local dependency, then we can add this to our package.json file. And we can also add a Prettier RC file written in JSON or YAML. I'm going to use this option just to show you how this works, but we have many different options afterwards. But I think these two will be the ones that you will be using most frequently. And you can see some basic configuration over here. This is an example with JSON format. We can set the trailing comma, tab width, if you want to use semicolons or single quotes, and this is very helpful. It's basically like the settings that we had in the settings panel of Visual Studio Code, but for a specific project. And in case you want to share these settings, you can share the file and just share it with your colleagues, and you can all follow the same rules very easily. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code and let's create one of these files. I'm going to create the new file, Prettier RC, like this, Prettier RC. And the file is going to be in JSON format, and I'm just going to set the tab width to be 2 and single quote to be true. So I'm going to set a tab width of 2 and single quote to true. Now let's see what happens if I write a line of code and I use double quotes. Hello world. And I'm also setting the tab width to 2 spaces, so let's just indent this with 4 spaces and let's see what happens. If I save the file, voila! You can see that now the double quotes were replaced by single quotes, so that is awesome. It can save us a lot of time. And the 4 spaces were replaced by only 2 spaces, so we're keeping the indentation consistent. And that's all thanks to the magic of this configuration file. Great! You can find a full list of the settings that you can customize over here if you go to the extension and the documentation and you go here to Prettier settings. All of these options can be configured directly in the extension. You can see bracket spacing, end of line, bracket on the same line, print width, semi, single quote, tab width, trailing comma if you want to use tabs, and all of these settings can also be customized in Visual Studio Code for the entire extension and for all your projects. So that is amazing, amazingly customizable. What if you want to ignore files and ignore lines of code? Because you won't always want to enforce those rules on all your files or all your lines of code. How can you just ignore them and continue formatting the rest of your files? Well, for that, you have something called a Prettier ignore file. If we go to the Prettier documentation again, and now we go to ignoring code, we can see that we can use Prettier ignore pretty much like a git ignore file. It's to ignore, not reformat certain files and folders completely. You can also use Prettier ignore comments to ignore parts of files. And this file should be created in the root of your project. It uses the git ignore syntax. So if you want to, for example, ignore all HTML files, you can just write this. 2 asterisks, a slash, another asterisk for any name, this is like a wildcard operator, and then the extension HTML. It's recommended to have a Prettier ignore in your project. This way you can run this command, which we will run in just a moment, to make sure that everything is formatted, but without actually modifying the files that you don't want to format. Your editor will know which files not to format. So let's do this, and let's go to our editor. Right now we have an index.js file and we have an index.html file. I'm going to make some changes here to the style just to break some rules over here, and I'm going to create that Prettier ignore file. Prettier ignore. And if we want to ignore all the, let's say, JavaScript files, we just need to write this. 2 asterisks, a slash, and then the wildcard for any name, any file name, .js. If we save this, and now we save our JavaScript file, you will see that it is not formatted. Previously it was. We do have format on saved automatically set up, but this is not working because we are ignoring all JavaScript files. If we do save the HTML file, it will be formatted according to the rules. So this is super helpful. It's like a git ignore file, but for Prettier. And this is also helpful in case you want to run a specific command. Let me show you this. It's very helpful, but for that we will need to go to our settings and disable format on save. Just in case you don't want to format your files on save and instead you want to run a command to format all your files. We do have a command line interface command that you can run. Let me show you this. I'm ignoring JavaScript files, so this is still going to stay exactly the same, and we're just going to format our HTML file with the command. Let me just remove this. Okay, like this. We're not formatting it on save anymore. And we're going to go to our terminal. Now, if we go to our terminal here, we can run the command npx prettier --write and a dot. The dot is telling the command that we want to format all the files in our current directory, which is Coding with Estefania, and its subdirectories. So if we had any folders here, all the files within those folders would also be formatted. But this process will still follow the rules that we have enforced in Prettier ignore, and it will ignore those files, or at least it should if we run the command. Let's see. Now, if we run the command, we see the output. Awesome. We see the files that were modified. We see all the files. This one, index.html, was formatted, and we see that other 3 files were unchanged. Now HTML is nicely formatted, but if we go to JavaScript, the file was ignored. So now we see that prettier.ignore did actually have an impact in the process. Now if we remove this from Prettier ignore, we save the file, and then we run the command again, Now we are formatting index.js and we see the file fixed and nicely formatted. Prettier is just a great time-saving tool. Another great thing about Prettier is that we can use comments in different programming languages to ignore specific parts of our code, so they are not formatted. Let's say that I want to ignore this conditional. I don't want this conditional to be formatted like this. I don't want anything to be formatted. How can I do that? Well, we do have some comments that are called Prettier ignore. They are individual comments that you can write in your programming language. We have different formats for different comments in different programming languages, and I'm going to show you that in the documentation. But in JavaScript, we just write this comment, Prettier ignore, and that will ignore the next node in the abstract syntax tree. In this case, that would be a conditional, it could be a for loop, it could be a variable definition. But now, if we save our file, let's also make some changes here to show you that only that part of the file is not being formatted. The file itself is being formatted. This should change to single quotes, and this should be fixed. But this conditional should remain exactly the same. So I'm going to save it, and I'm going to run Prettier. I'm going to run it in the command line. Remember that we disabled the format on save option, so I'm going to run it in the command line. And we do see that index.js was fixed correctly. This line was formatted and this line was formatted to use single quotes. But this one stayed exactly the same because we added Prettier ignore. If we go to the documentation in the same ignoring code article in the documentation, and we check this over here, we can see that in JavaScript we just need this comment that we used. Then in JSX we can also add this comment if we're working, for example, with React. In HTML, it's just like a normal HTML comment. Here we can also see that we want to ignore the attribute. So we have an option to add the attribute here in the comment. And we can also ignore specific attributes. You can see that here we're specifying mouse up. So this attribute is not formatted when we format the file. It's really powerful. In CSS, we also have this comment, and in Markdown, we also have the option to ignore the next line over here with this comment. So it's super powerful. I highly recommend referring to this documentation to learn more about the different things that you can do in different languages. It's a very versatile tool. The key takeaways from this video are that Prettier automates your code formatting process, it improves code readability, helps you to follow best practices, it saves you time, which is always super helpful, and it ensures that you and your team are being consistent in your code because the process of formatting is done automatically for all of you and you can share your configuration files to follow exactly the same rules. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, I do appreciate your likes and subscribe. It really means so much to me and it helps the channel if you subscribe and like the videos. Have an awesome day.